right, perfect. I think we're ready to go. That was nice and quick and easy, wasn't it? So guys, welcome to another session of virtual wine tasting with me, Jeff. I'm the winemaker for Tractors Vineyard. This session's going to be a little bit longer because we're running low on rosé, and so I've changed the packs over to have a look at our semi-dry Riesling. So for the next few sessions, we're going to have a look at both of those as we go through. So it just will mean it's a little bit longer than our normal hour, but hopefully that doesn't make a big difference. So Tractors Vineyard, if you don't know, we're based down in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales. We run the vineyard all biodynamically. We then run sheep through the vineyard for the whole growing season, which means we use a tractor about 60% less. So that's where the name comes from. We're trying to be quite a little sustainable label. So we've got solar on the roof. We're doing some research and some work into some geothermal things. We do stuff like these bottles that we use, actually special low carbon bottles. So they use about half the carbon of a normal wine bottle, which also means they're a lot lighter. And so we use a lot less carbon when we're shipping them out. And so, you know, we're trying to be quite sustainable. We've got some new initiatives coming up where we're trying to offset people's purchases or their freight purchases against some tree plantations and things like that. But these are all works in the future. So we're getting there though, we're getting there. Let's get into the real reason we're here, taste some wine. So we're gonna start off with our Sauvignon Blanc. Now I know you guys, because of the light, you either see me or the label. Hang on, what I'll do is I'll turn it off so you can look at the label. Yeah, so that's our Sauvignon Blanc. We always start off with the Sauvignon Blanc. Now, I'm actually not a huge fan of Sauvignon Blanc normally. I find them really a bit over the top and a bit too fruity and a bit like, you know, it's all bang in your face. And so I actually make this in what's called a fumé style. And a fumé style is essentially a Sauvignon Blanc that's been fermented in oak. And what I love about the fermenting in oak is it kind of just mellows it out a bit. So that's, you know, my personality and my winemaking style is a bit more relaxed, a bit more mellowed out. And so that's why I use this style. The other interesting thing we do for our Sauvignon Blanc is we do a double pick. So we pick half of it at around about 9% Beaumais. Now, when I talk about Beaumais, this is a sugar level. And just like temperature, you know, of temperature, you can get degrees Celsius, degrees Fahrenheit, degrees Kelvin. You know, it's a similar thing with sugar measures. You can get, you know, grams per liter, you can get bricks, you can get Beaumais, you can get specific gravity. There's always different measures, but I use Beaumais. The reason I use Beaumais is just because it's a really simple conversion. So if I take 1 Beaumais of sugar and I ferment it with yeast, I end up with pretty much 1% alcohol at the end. So it's just a really nice conversion. So whilst we're tasting, if I say 9 Beaumais or 9% alcohol, it's sort of on par with each other. So at least you know sort of what I'm talking about. So we harvest half of this at 9 Beaumais, and that gives us that really nice, crisp, fresh green acid, little bit of lantana and that freshness to it. We then wait about 2 or 3 weeks, and then we harvest the second half around about that 12.5 to 13% alcohol Beaumais. And that gives us that passion fruit and that tropical flavors to the wines. And then we ferment it all in oak. So all old oak, nothing new. That's why you get a little bit of that, sort of a little bit of that nice vanilla character on the nose when you smell it, which makes it, it actually smells, when you smell it, you think it's going to be a little bit sweet because of that vanilla character, but definitely is a bone dry Sauvignon Blanc. So yeah, that riper portion gives us that tropical passion fruit, all fermented in older oak and also matured a bit in oak as well. And that gives you that nice texture and that lingering finish, and it mellows out all those flavors. So one of the best things about these virtual tastings is I get to enjoy the wine with you guys. Normally I don't get to because I've got to drive home, but seeing as I'm already at home, it's a perfect excuse for me to have a few wines. If you happen to have in front of you like a nice Edam or Jalsberg or something, that's a great match for this Sauvignon Blanc. And it's a good example of how cold we are. So to get those real punchy sort of tropical flavors in a Sauvignon Blanc, you need to be quite a cold region. A lot of people don't realize how cold the Southern Highlands are because we're probably, because we're only about an hour and a half from Sydney, everyone thinks we're similar temperature. But our lowest vineyard is at 500 meters. And as such, we're quite cold. Some years we actually harvest after Tasmania. And if we look across the whole of Australia and we're trying to find a very similar wine region, temperature-wise and climate-wise to us, Yarra Valley is probably really quite close. Yarra Valley and some of the warmer sections of Tasmania are similar. So, it means varieties like Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Grigio Gris, Chardonnay, Riesling, Pinot Noir, they're sort of those cool climate varieties are what really suits this region. In the Cellar d'Or, I used to always get a lot of people coming in asking me what's the difference between a Gris and a Grigio. And so we decided to make the two so that we can show you guys the difference. So that's what we're going to look at next. We're actually going to just work our way down that tasting list you guys have. So next we're going to have a look at the Grigio. So Gris and Grigio are both made from the exact same grape variety. They're both made from the Pinot Gris grape variety. Pinot Grigio is the Italian way of doing it, and Pinot Gris is the French way of doing it. So we're going to start with the Italian way. Now, the first thing you'll notice, and again, there's our label there. The first thing you'll notice, the first thing of difference really between the two is actually the winemaking philosophy. So the Italians are really conscious of the food that it's going to be drunk with. So you could almost to an extent say that the Italians are making it to go with a specific food. I mean, it's not that exact, but they are definitely very conscious of food when they're making it. The French, on the other hand, are only concerned about the wine when they're making it. And so it results in quite stylistic differences. If we think of Italy, think a lot of warmer climate, a lot of maritime, a lot of seafood down there. So the Italians, when they're making their Grigio style, are trying to make something that's zippy and crisp and a beautiful sort of clean, steely palate and freshness to it. So to do this, the first thing the Italians do is they harvest it really quite early. So they harvest it at around about 11 to 12 Beaumet. So it ends up being about 11 to 12% alcohol. The French, probably about 3 or 4 weeks later. So when we ripen a grape, one of the things that's happening is our sugar levels are slowly going up and our acid levels are slowly going down. So if we want to create a wine that's got that fresh, crisp acid, we harvest it a little bit earlier. So our acid levels are a little bit higher. And also it helps that there's a slightly lower alcohol because alcohol can also make a wine feel big and round in the mouth. So Italians harvest at that sort of nice early 11 to 12% alcohol mark. The second thing is Italians are not afraid of oxygen at all. So when I make this wine, we press off the Pinot Gris or Gris grapes. It goes into a tank, and then I actually get a bucket and I fill it from the bottom of the tank and I tip it in the top, and I fill it from the bottom and I tip it in the top. And I probably do that 10 or 20 times until all the juice actually goes brown from the amount of oxygen that's gone in. And then I do a really long, slow, cold ferment. And what that oxygen helps with is helps with getting that, you get this nice sort of green apple character to the nose, but you also get this beautiful steely sort of crisp palate. And that's what the oxygen does in the ferment. And also that final cool and long fermentation rather than a warm, quick one gives me crisper, fresher acids and fresher mouthfeel and sort of a fresher palate as well. And this, you can see zippy, crisp, nice sort of clean, steely palate. You know, if you're lucky enough to have some oysters or something in front of you there, you know, my favorite match of this wine is you get these beautiful South Coast oysters and from just down Bateman's Bay way. And they're just a little bit smaller than normal ones, and they're really nice and sweet. And so those oysters matched with this wine, I reckon, is one of my favorite matches around. But it goes really well with any sort of seafood at all. And guys, don't be nervous. If you are nervous, to put your hand up. You're also still welcome to write in the webinar chat any questions as we go along too. So more than welcome. Happy to answer as we go. So that's Pinot Grigio. So next we're going to look at our Pinot Gris. If I'm going a little bit fast, don't worry, because everything comes with a little bit of talking and story, so you don't have to jump on to the next wine straight away. Pinot Gris is the French way of doing it. Now, if we think about the French and Pinot Gris in France, most Pinot Gris is grown up in Alsace, so it's on the French-German border. It's a little bit cooler up there. The French are trying to create a wine that stands by itself. And so the French are trying to create a big, round, soft, voluptuous style of wine. So the first thing they do to do this is they're harvesting it a lot later. So usually about 3 or 4 weeks later, when the alcohol's sort of at that 13 to 14% alcohol. And as a result, one of the first things you'll see, and you'll probably see it in your glass a lot better than mine, is that color. And it's got this quite a bronzy color to it. And that's because Pinot Gris, as it ripens, starts to develop a little bit of color to it. So initially it's just a green grape, and the Italians probably only ever really see it as a green grape because they're harvesting it when it's still green. As it gets to that sort of high 12s, early 13 sort of a sugar level, starts to get a little bit of a pink color on the skins. Now, grapevines, when they're hanging in the grape bunches, when they're hanging in the vines, get like a dusting of yeast on the outside, and so you get this sort of white dusting on it. And so when you see these light pink bunches covered in dust in the distance, they actually look grey, and that's where the name comes from. So the French word for grey is gris, and so Pinot, because it's a cousin of the Pinots, Pinot Meunier, Pinot Noir. And Gris because the bunches look grey on the vines. So Pinot Gris is where the name comes from. And as I said, the Italians don't really get to see that grey colour because they're harvesting it a lot earlier. The French, harvesting it later, they're trying to create a bigger, riper wine. And so Pinot Gris will always usually have that sort of bronzy colour to it. Sometimes it gets a little bit of pinky colour to it as well when in those warmer climates. So it's one of the first big differences we see between those two wines. The second thing is if you look in your glass carefully, you'll see sort of up here on your glass is this clear rim of liquid that's then dribbling back down into your glass. And we call this the legs. And what that is essentially is all the volatile components in that wine. So all the components in that wine that can evaporate at room temperature, they evaporate out and then they're condensating on your glass up here and they're dribbling back in. And we don't see that as much in the Grigio because most of what that is the alcohol. Because Grigio is a lot lower alcohol, we don't see that quite as much. And this actually has a really interesting effect on the wine. So if you had to smell that wine, you would probably say to me that that has more aroma to it than the Pinot Grigio, because it definitely seems that way on the glass when you smell it. The interesting thing is if I was actually to analyze the aroma compounds of the two wines, the Grigio has a lot more aroma compounds than the Gris. And what's happening is as that alcohol evaporates out of that wine and that glass, it's grabbing onto all these other flavor compounds with it and pulling them out of the glass as well. And so we get this hit of aroma with it. And what you often find with this higher alcohol is what you're smelling now is what you get. So it's a wine that when you put it in your mouth and let it develop in your mouth, it doesn't open up as much and give you more because it's kind of already given it to you from that alcohol. Whereas that Grigio, if you put it in your mouth, let it warm up in your mouth or have it with some food, it will really open up and really get all these other flavors coming in as the wine develops in your mouth. So it's one of the things that I'm always really careful of when I'm tasting Italian styles and Italian wines in the cellar door, specifically, or especially when I don't have food, is it's really easy to let a wine like this Gris to overpower it. And so I often will probably spend a little bit more time tasting a Grigio or even try and go back to it later and have another taste on it, and just to see if it develops a bit more and opens up a bit more. So it's one of the interesting effects of this alcohol in here. The next thing you'll see when you taste it, is a really completely different style of wine. Soft, round, voluptuous, and it's got a little bit of this like oiliness to it, like a viscosity. And that's one of the key things that we're really chasing for for a good Pinot Gris, is this viscosity. And how we get that is, if I have a high ripeness level in my grapes and I ferment it at quite a warm temperature, I create in the fermentation process what's called glycerols, and those glycerols give you that sort of like oily feeling on the palate. The problem with fermenting at warmer temperatures, though, yes, we get great mouthfeel, yes, we get that nice glycerol, but what we're doing is we're blowing off loads and loads of our aroma compounds. So we're losing a lot of aroma compounds. And as a result, to try and hold those compounds in, the French are super, super afraid of oxygen. So whereas Italians, they used oxygen in their process, the French are super afraid of oxygen. So every time we transfer this wine from one tank to another, or transfer the juice from one area to another, I do it completely under carbon dioxide cover. So really super, super protected from the oxygen. And as a result, we create these two really different styles of wine. And it's a great example of what the winemaker and the viticulturist can do to really affect the final styles. And I'm sure if I didn't tell you these two wines were in actual fact the same grape variety to start with, you probably wouldn't believe me. And these two that we've just tried are actually from the exact same vineyard, exact same block. And really the only difference is about 3 or 4 weeks harvest date, and then the winemaking techniques. And we've created these vastly different styles of wine. We've got our Pinot Gris at this end of the spectrum, and then we've got, our Pinot Grigio at this end of the spectrum, and our Pinot Gris at this end of the spectrum. And then you've got all your variations in between. And somewhere in the middle, we've got this crossover. And so these two styles are really quite confusing. The other thing in Australia that actually makes it even more confusing is the terms Pinot Grigio and Gris are not defined in labeling law. And so what that means is, if you walk into a bottle shop and get a Gris or a Grigio, it can be a little bit of a lucky dip. And I actually have worked for big companies before. My background's consulting in big companies, where we've made a wine that may be a Pinot Gris, for example, and depending on what the marketers thought would sell better at the time, it's either labeled Grigio or Gris, the same wine at different times of the year. So it's a little bit confusing for us as consumers in Australia at the moment. This is changing. Probably about maybe 2 or 3 years ago, when I entered a wine in a wine show, I'd be entering it as a wine made from a Pinot Gris grape. Now, when I enter in a wine show, I'm entering it either as a Pinot Grigio or Pinot Gris. And so if I was, for example, to put that Pinot Grigio in a Pinot Gris class, even though it's a beautiful wine, a great example of a Pinot Grigio, it would get 0 marks because it's not a Pinot Gris. And so this is the beginning. From here, what will happen is, over the next 3 to 5 years, the wine show will really clearly define what's a Grigio and what's a Gris. And from there, that will probably flow on to labeling law. And eventually one day we'll be able to walk into a bottle shop and know exactly what's a Grigio and what's a Gris. So it is changing. It is a difficult area, especially when you get in that middle area as well, what defines a Grigio and Gris. And so hopefully over the next few years, we'll slowly define that and get our heads around it a bit more. But interesting what the winemaker can do. I hope you're Chardonnay drinkers. Chardonnay is what we're moving on to next. Chardonnay, I love. I do a lot of these sessions. We do private sessions. So if you've got a group of 10 people or more, you can actually book a private virtual tasting with me. And I love asking people whether they drink Chardonnay. And I reckon the response is 20% say yes, 80% say either no or very non-committal or not sure. And I think this is a little bit of a result of the history of Chardonnay in Australia. You know, in the sort of early 70s and 80s, it was all about oak. And we got these super, super oaky Chardonnays. And then late 90s, early 2000s, it was all about no oak. So we had these really fruity Chardonnays. And we all have these sort of memories, perhaps good, perhaps bad, of these very distinct styles. And I think that upsets us a bit when we think about Chardonnay because we've defined them in these two big styles. For me, Chardonnay is about balance. I want to see a little bit of oak. I want to see a little bit of these buttery flavors. I want to see a little bit of fruit, but I don't want any one of those flavors to overpower the Chardonnay. I want to see them all in a nice balance. And for me, Chardonnay is a variety that we're probably making some of the best Chardonnay we've ever made in Australia at the moment because we really got our heads around this balance. Um, you know, the funny thing is despite only 20% of people telling me that they're Chardonnay drinkers, it is still beyond a doubt the biggest white wine that sells across Australia and the biggest white wine that sells in our cellar door. It's definitely not trendy at the moment. One day I hope it will come back to trend. Maybe Kath and Kim had something to do with that, I'm not sure. But we're making some great Chardonnay in Australia. It's a really fun variety to make as a winemaker. Every little thing you do as a winemaker, you can really taste it in the final wine. So that Gris and Grigio, the winemaking techniques to make them different are really big differences. If I did something little between those two, you probably wouldn't notice the difference. Whereas with a Chardonnay, if I do something little, it's really obvious in the final wine, which makes it a really fun wine to make. It's kind of almost like a blank canvas, but it makes it a really scary wine to make because if you do something wrong, it's really obvious in the final wine. Now, Chardonnay, if you taste this Chardonnay, actually, if you happen to have like a really nice creamy brie in front of you, like a fromage dauphinois or a nice triple brie there, then that is a great match for the Chardonnay. And what I find is if you take a sip of the Chardonnay and you get that nice balance of a little bit of oak to start with, and then you get a fresh bit of fruit, and then that more riper grapefruit and butteriness sort of lingers around. If you then have a bit of the brie and then come back to the Chardonnay, you'll find all that butteriness and the fruit character is really lifted out of it, and it really blends nicely with the brie. It's one of my favorite matches with this wine, and that buttery flavor is something really interesting. It's actually from a secondary ferment. So all of our wines go through the primary ferment, which is a yeast ferment, which converts the sugar into alcohol. So it's the one that makes alcohol. It's probably the most important part of the whole process. Our Chardonnay and our red wines go through a secondary ferment, and this second ferment is actually a bacterial ferment, and it's a bacteria that converts the malic acid, which is the same acid that you find in an apple, and it converts it to lactic acid, which is the same acid you find in milk. So it's a creamier, softer acid. Now, a byproduct of this fermentation or secondary fermentation is these buttery flavors. Now, it was sort of in the middle of the 80s, there's this famous wine writer that said, "Oh, I'm so sick of these buttery Chardonnays." And so the companies that actually produced this bacteria started selecting against this buttery flavor. So now when I go out to buy a commercially available strain of this bacteria, it doesn't produce this buttery character. So what we've done, we've found an old strain of bacteria. We use about 5% of that in the barrels just to get a little bit of that buttery flavor. And to me, it's definitely obviously there. Like, it's not overpowering, but I can definitely see the vanilla, the butteriness, and the fruit. So you could imagine if we were using 100% of that in our barrels, you can imagine how overpowering that buttery flavor would be. And so, that's only 5%. Nice balance. I kind of hope that this Chardonnay in this balanced fashion does sway a few people to think that, or at least admit that they're drinking Chardonnay again. I'm sure we're all closet Chardonnay drinkers, but it's a style that I love. I think we're doing really well in Australia in this style, and I hope that in the next few years Chardonnay becomes trendy again because I actually really love it as a wine variety. as long as it's in nice balance like this one. So I think next we might do, the semi-dry Riesling. So some of you will have this, some of you won't, because this is the one we've changed over. So I think I'm gonna try it this way this time, and then next time we might switch it around. We'll see. So next we go to our semi-dry Riesling. This is a German style Riesling. It's well, semi-dry, so it's a sweeter style. You know, I think one of the things that Australia to date doesn't do really well is sweet wines and off-dry wines. You know, I think in the past, too many of these off-dry wines have been done by big companies. You know, when I'm making an off-dry wine for a big company and I've got 100,000 litre ferment, for example, it's just too hard to stop that ferment. So in a big company, we'll usually ferment it dry and then back add some concentrate or something to sweeten it up again. As a result, you end up with this usually quite cloying, sickly sweet wine. If you're making it in traditional methods or traditional European ways, what you're doing is you're actually stopping the ferment using temperature or filtration or a bit of both. You're stopping the ferment before it's finished. And so you're retaining the natural sugars of the grapes. And as a result, you get a sweetness that is crisper and cleaner and fresher. And it's kind of like, you know, when you bite into an apple, you know, apple's really quite fresh and clean and crisp, but the sweetness level or the sugar level of an apple is actually quite high. And so because it's a natural sort of sweetness and a natural acid, it just gives us that freshness. And that's what I do in any of our sweet wines. So this Riesling is a bit of a throwing back to these old European style Rieslings. It's also aged a bit. It's got some really nice aged Riesling characters to it. And I think it's a really good example of that freshness that you can get to a sweeter wine. It's got that, I think of it as a real luscious sort of beautiful sweet, but fruity sweet and fresh character to it. And I love that. Actually really love that Riesling. I'm drinking more and more of it as it gets older. We're starting to get some of those nice bottle aged characters in it, but it's a wine that I'm quite happy to include in our little tasting packs again now, because you know, it's something that we don't see that often in Australia. I was a little bit worried about repouring a sweeter wine into these little bottles and sending them around, but to date I haven't had any problems, so fingers crossed it all stays that way. Rosé. Hope I'm not moving too quick, but I'm trying to like skip through those two a little bit because mostly I only have one or the other. So the first thing you'll see in our rosé are these cute little bottles. Now for me, rosé is a little bit of a lunchtime wine or summer wine. And so these bottles are 500 ml bottles. They were created because it means two people can sit down at lunchtime and drink the whole bottle and still be under the limit and go back to work afterwards. And so that's why I use these bottles. Unfortunately, I can't get the 500 ml bottles anymore. And so next year, one of you might not have to, maybe won't go back to work or something, but we'll leave that up to you to work it out. The other thing you'll notice with rosé is that color. That's quite a dark color for what's trendy in rosés at the moment. What's trendy in a rosé at the moment are they sort of blush, quite pale, Southern France, Provence style rosés. And, you know, I'm not one to follow trends. I am a huge, huge fan of texture in my wines. And you'll notice as you taste those white wines, you can smell them, you can taste them, but you also get this really nice mouthfeel in the wines as well, this textural component. And to get that in the rosé, I need to leave it with the skins a little bit longer. And so what that means, a lot of people don't realize, if I take a red grape and I squeeze it, the juice and the pulp inside is actually white. So to make a red wine, I actually have to ferment it with the skins to extract all the color. To make a rosé, I leave it with the skins for a certain period of time until I get the color or the flavor or the texture that I want. So those sort of Southern France, Provence style rosés, they probably spend maybe 1 hour maybe 2 hours sitting with the skins before we press them off. Our rosé, I leave it with the skins and I taste it and I taste it and I taste it until I get here. So middle of my tongue there. So I get this really nice furry feeling. When I start to get that furry feeling, I press it off. And as a result, it's a lot darker. It's usually around about that 10 to 12 hour mark that's been sitting with the skins. So we get a much darker color in the rosé. But I love that texture. So I'm happy to have that dark color with the texture. The other thing you'll notice with this rosé, those beautiful strawberry characters, that's because it's 100% Pinot Noir rosé, and you get that nice strawberry from the Pinot. And we grow these grapes specifically for rosé. So for me, one of the big mistakes with a rosé is that winemakers are either making a pink white or they're making a light red. And rosé to me should be rosé. It sits in between the two. It's got some nice textures and creaminess of a red wine, but it's also got these fresh components of a white wine. So for us to really get that rosé the way I want it, we're specifically growing it for rosé in the vineyard, and our yields are different and our techniques in the vineyard are quite different just to get that. And so, you know, this wine, I think as a result, we get this beautiful fresh rosé that has this texture and a bit more weight to it. So for me, you know, a nice charcuterie board or some antipasta is a really good match for this wine. And that's actually how it was made. I was sitting on my deck here at home, out in the sun, having some antipasta and some charcuterie, and I thought, you know what? I need to make a nice, dry, textured rosé to go with this. And so that's why we made this wine. And I love it. Unfortunately, if you love this and you want to get some, better get on quick because I'm about to run out of the rosé. This is also a variety that we do quite regularly every year. Unfortunately, this year we lost all our grapes to the smoke taint from the bushfires. And so when this sells out, there's going to be a bit of a gap in supply for rosé. So everyone will just have to wait for the 2021 vintage for our next rosé, most likely. So one of the, we're lucky that we've got a lot of stuff in stock, but all those fresh varieties that we turn over quite regularly, they're the ones that we're going to run out of over the next year or so. But for me, down here in the Highlands, starting to get a bit cold. You know, I've got the heater cranked, but outside, I think maybe it's about a maximum of 8 or 9 degrees. So I'm drinking red wines. So the first red we're going to taste is this one, which is called the Lost Flock. I'll turn that down again. So you'll notice quite a different label. These are our old labels. This was before I could afford to get a great artist to do our labels. It's also part of our creators series. So you notice on your notes, we've got 2 series. We've got our sustainable series, which is the one with the tractor. And then we've got our creators series, which is that one with the barrels. And the difference is that our sustainable series is 100% off our local biodynamic vineyards. And our creators series is not 100% or not off our local biodynamic vineyards. And, you know, sometimes we don't have enough fruit. Sometimes we've got vineyards in conversion, that sort of thing. And so that goes under the creators label. I really wanted to clearly define what's off our biodynamic blocks and what isn't. The other thing is things like Shiraz, for example, way too cold down here in the Southern Highlands for Shiraz. And so, got my light back on again. And so that's why I work closely with some growers in the hilltops. They're about 2 hours from us, and that's where we get our Shiraz from. And so that also goes under our creators label. So that's why I created the 2 labels. So Lost Flock is actually a blend. So some of it's from our biodynamic block, some of it's not. So it goes under the creators label. This was actually designed, I was sitting at home, I was sitting in front of the fire having a nice big Barossa red, which I love. You know, I love those sort of velvety textures and the nice raspberry characters that you get, but I find them a little bit heavy sometimes, and I can only, you know, have a glass or 2. And I wanted to create something that I could drink the bottle of in front of the fire. Not that I'm telling anyone they should be drinking a bottle by themselves, but that may have been the reason I made this. And so I came up with this blend, which is essentially a GSM. It's Grenache, Shiraz, Mourvedre. It's also got a little bit of Merlot and Petit Verdot. And this is just my soft, easy drinking, everyday red. And you get those when you taste it. You get those beautiful sort of velvety tannins, that nice chocolate character, and then this lingering raspberry aftertaste, which is from the Grenache, which I just love, and it hangs around. And this wine, I can have another sip of that. This wine, it's actually probably the red I drink the most of, partially because, you know, you go to a dinner party or barbecue or something, and, you know, some people like Shiraz and some people like Merlot and some people like Grenache, or you bring a blend, you got the highest chance of everyone finding one flavor in that wine they like. And so, you know, it's probably the wine I take to dinner parties and that sort of thing the most. This wine is something special for us because of the name. Now, when you choose to go biodynamic or organic, you're doing it from a really philosophical point of view. If I'm to make a Shiraz, for example, and I put it in a bottle shop, the market will value that at, say, $30 a bottle. If I'm to make an organic or biodynamic Shiraz and put it in the bottle shop, the market still only values it at $30. So at the moment, there's no advantage from a market value point of view to being biodynamic or organic. It's starting to change a little bit, but at the moment, it's still not there. The problem with going biodynamic or organic is it's a lot more expensive to run your vineyard. There's a lot more labor costs involved, and most of those costs are related to managing the grass. And so for an industrial vineyard, you know, I pretty much either herbicide all the grass, or I herbicide strips underneath the grapevines, and then I mow the other little bit. And so it's a lot cheaper to manage it. For biodynamic and organic, you know, probably in this region anyway, almost every second week, I have to mow and cultivate under the vines to manage that grass, which means it's very costly for us. In 2013, I think it was, we actually had a caterpillar problem in the vineyard. And the biodynamic principle says that if you have insect problems on your land, it's because you don't have enough animals there to balance. And so we started experimenting with sheep. So first we decided, let's try some Dorpers. You know, they're wool sheds. We won't have to worry about shearing them. Great idea. Well, unfortunately, a Dorper is pretty much like a goat. So they ate half the vineyard. So this experiment did not work well at all. I grew up on a merino farm, and merinos are what we call grazing sheep. Now, Dorpers are browsing sheep, which means they look everywhere for food. Wherever they can find it, they'll look for it and eat it. Merinos are grazing sheep. And what that means is they only look within their feeding zone, and they eat within their feeding zone, and they don't look outside of their feeding zone until they've run out of food there. And so the merinos kind of worked. The grapevine sat here. The bunches hung down a little bit into their feeding zone. And so what we did was actually run electrical wires under the bunches like this, and that worked quite well. It stopped the sheep touching the bunches. So this, you know, this experiment was semi-successful. Unfortunately, when electricity goes out, it's amazing how much a sheep can eat in one day. So whilst it was a sort of successful experiment, we still lost a lot because when the power went out, they ate. Eventually, we found a breed called Hampshire Downs, and they're an English breed. They're from the UK. They're the ones with the little black faces and white wool. They're quite a cute little sheep. They're a little bit shorter than a merino, probably 2 or 3 inches shorter. And what that means is the merino, the grapevines sit here, and the Hampshire Downs, the grapevines sit here. And it's just, even with the bunches hanging down, it's just outside their feeding zone. And so as long as there's grass on the ground, the Hampshire Downs don't touch the grapevine. So this is quite successful. It solved our caterpillar problem. I come from a very big scientific background and science family. And so what I believe is because they're keeping the grass short all the time, it interrupts the breeding cycle of the caterpillars to some extent. And so that's why we get a better balance in there. Now, the caterpillars are still there. but they're not causing us any problem now. And biodynamics, it's important to understand that biodynamics isn't about eliminating stuff. It's not about eliminating the caterpillars. It's about bringing everything back into a natural, healthy balance and working with everything. And so that's exactly what having the sheep in there have done. Now, I don't know why I didn't think about it at the time, but guess what? Sheep eat grass. And so as a result, by solving our caterpillar problem, we've solved the most expensive part of our biodynamic organic problem as well, which is the sheep eating the grass. And so now, because we can run these sheep under the grapevines for the whole growing season, every second week, I'm saving a tractor pass and a cultivate. So I'm saving loads of money now. And the biodynamic vineyard combined with the sheep is probably the same, if not a little bit cheaper than an industrial vineyard. We're actually getting quite good with the sheep now. And there's a process we do once a year that we call leaf plucking. And what that is around about January, you've got the bunches hanging down like this, and then they're covered by the leaves. And what we want to do is remove the leaf, because we want the sunlight to penetrate those bunches, because it helps with disease, but two, it also helps with some of the flavor development in the grapes. So normally what we'd be doing is we'd be paying these teams and teams of people to go through and rip off all the leaves like this, which is quite costly. What we worked out is, if at a very specific time of the grapevines growing, so when the berries are hard and green and the shoots have lignified. So what I mean by lignified is, if I've got a young shoot and I grab a leaf and I pull it, I rip off the whole shoot. If I wait till that shoot lignifies and I grab a leaf and I pull it, I only rip the leaf off. And so when the berries are hard and green and the shoots are lignified, as normal, I put the sheep in that block and they eat the grass. And after about 3 or 4 days, they'll eat the grass. So we have a high number of sheep and we kind of strip graze them. We want them to eat everything in that block in about 3 or 4 days and then move them on. So they eat all the grass in 3 or 4 days, and normally I'd move them on. But at this time of the year, when the berries are hard and green, we've got lignified shoots, I actually leave the sheep in that block, and they run out of food on the ground and they start looking up for food, and they'll actually eat the first 2 leaves of the grapevine. And they've done this job for us. And it actually looks like someone's gone through with a ruler through the vineyard and put them exactly where we want them. So now our biodynamic vineyards with the sheep are far, far more cost effective and cheaper to run than industrial vineyards. So the inclusion of the sheep have completely changed the landscape for us. The other great thing about Hampshire Downs is they're roaming sheep. Now, things like merinos flock. And what that means is we get these sheep camps with all this poo and often killed grass in sections of the vineyard. And we get a lot of sheep compaction tracks where they're walking along the same tracks. Because the Hampshire Downs roam around, they're spread across the whole vineyard. Fantastic for the vineyard. Absolute nightmare when I go to shear them, because there's always 2 really woolly sheep wandering around the place that I've missed when I've gone to shear them. But this spreading out actually reminded me of the barrels in the winery. So when I made this wine, I stack all the Shiraz together, all the Merlot together in their barrels, all the Grenache together. And because this is a blend, all the little barrel stacks were all over the winery, which reminded me of the sheep being all over the vineyard. And so that's why we call this wine the Lost Flock. And that's why it's a really special wine to me, is because the sheep are so important in what we do in our systems. Like biodynamics, it guides us and we follow the principles, but the sheep have fundamentally changed the way we do biodynamics in the vineyard. And to be honest, it's probably more legitimately biodynamic with the sheep, because what biodynamics is about creating these natural systems on the farm. And so without the sheep, we don't really have this natural system. And so, there's only now a 6-week period of the whole year where we don't have animals on our vineyard. So in winter, we put the cattle in and the sheep. In the summer growing period, we just have the sheep. And then when the grapes get sweet, we get a lot of bird problems. So we have to net the vineyard. And as a result, we can't leave the sheep in there. I've just started talking to and working with a local free range chicken farmer. And I really hope that we can get the chickens running underneath the nets during this 6-week process, because that would bring in another species of animal, which is the more species you can have on your land, the better. And it can have them working under the grapevines and under the nets for that 6-week period. So that's maybe in the future we'll have some eggs and chicken to eat as well. So we'll see. But that's we'll get there. So the Lost Block very special. Is probably the wine I drink the most of. Not my favorite wine though. So the next wine is my favorite wine, and that's our Pinot. So this Pinot, in Australia we make these beautiful, delicate Pinots. They always remind me of ballerinas. They're light and delicate on the palate, but they're really complex and interesting at the same time. Now, I love those styles, but I also love some old school styles. So this is not that light, delicate style. This is an old, funky Burgundian style. So when we make this, lots of whole bunches go in, lots of stems go in. As a result, when I first bottle it, it's almost undrinkable. It's really bitter and resiny and stemsy, and it needs that time in the bottle to really settle down. So, if you've been lucky enough to travel into Burgundy in France, it's a similar thing. A lot of the cellar doors there or caves there, they don't have Pinots that are usually under about 4 years old, and that's because they use this technique there. The technique creates these big, funky, beautiful Pinots. My accountant hates this wine because it sits in the cellar after all expenses, not being sold for at least 3 years. I love this wine, so he doesn't get a say in it. And over that period, what happens is that bitterness and that resiny character settles down and the fruit characters come out. But what we end up with is a much more complex, bigger style of Pinot that is going to age and age and age and age and age. And one of the things that we're really chasing with this sort of style of Pinot are these aged characters we sort of call forest floor and cigar box. And if you've ever opened a cigar box, it's kind of like it's a woody smell, but it's a sweet wood. It's not like a dry wood. And we're just starting to get hints of that in this now. And I love that wine. Really nice, funky style. Just starting to see those hints of cigar box now. That's just going to age and age and age and age and age. Other thing you'll notice is a little bit cloudy. That's because this is one of our more natural wines, unfiltered, all vegan. I love this wine. We're probably going to stop selling it in the next few months because I actually want to hold back a lot of wines. Like, I love aged wines. I want to hold back a lot of wines specifically for our club members. And so I reckon in the next month or so, we'll probably stop selling this, hold it back for our club members, and move on to one of our newer vintages. That's our Pinot, big funky style. That's going to give 20, 30, 40, 50, like it's designed to age. It's definitely going to last years and years in the cellar. And a great match I find for venison. So often you match Pinots with like gamey meats, more those lighter gamey meats, pheasant, duck, that sort of thing, because the heavier meats, a bit overpowering for those nice, light, delicate styles that we make. This, because it's that big old school funky style, it can definitely handle those bigger sort of venison flavors and that sort of thing. In actual fact, one of my favorite matches, I think last year or the year before, in the Southern Highlands, we have this 1 month that we call Pie Time, which is June every year. And we're the capital of Australia for pies. And for that month, we do a pie and Pinot degustation where we do 4 or 5 little pies matched with wines or Pinots. And we did a venison and juniper berry pie matched with this Pinot. And it was beautiful. It's one of my favorite matches. Next, we're going to move on to our Shiraz. Shiraz, interestingly enough, out of all our wines, the Shiraz is probably the most Australian winemaking techniques that we use out of anything by a long way. And, I had to do an Australian Shiraz. We were put on the world wine map because of Shiraz in Australia. Originally our warm climate Shirazes, now our cool climate Shiraz. My first job when I finished school, so I finished year 12, And my first job was with a winery called Clonakilla in Canberra, who are really famous for their cool climate Shiraz. And so this wine brings back so much memories of working there. I love cool climate Shiraz, so that's why I had to do it. The reason it's in such Australian style is I've tried all these different techniques. I've been making wine now for 22 years. So I've tried all these different techniques and played around with all these things. And all the different techniques, yes, they add a little bit of interest or they create a Shiraz that's quite a little bit different. But fundamentally, great Shiraz in Australia just doesn't like being fiddled with. It really doesn't. It just likes to be clean and presented the way it wants to be. And so, you know, this is probably our easiest, most commercial winemaking. It's destemmed. It's fermented for 3 weeks without the stems on the skins. It's then pressed off into oak, 12 to 18 months in oak, and then into bottle. So really, you know, 90% of Australian reds are probably made like that. It's quite simple commercial techniques, but geez, it works. It works every time with Australian Shiraz. And, you know, if you drink a lot of cool climate Australian Shiraz, you definitely will not be disappointed with this. This is a very typical cool climate Shiraz. I don't know why I don't drink more of that. I think it's because I'm worried that there's people out there that don't like Shiraz. They find it a little bit spicy. And one of the comments I get back the most from this Shiraz is, oh, I really like that because it's not too peppery. And to me, that is one of 2 key factors for a really good cool climate Shiraz. I want to see a little bit of spice, but not too much. If you drink a Shiraz and it's peppery and spicy, for me that means the region's too cold. That's part of the reason I don't make the Shiraz from here in the Highlands, because we're too cold. Young, which is about 2 hours, the Hilltop region in Young there, that's where we get our Shiraz fruit from. We work really closely with a grower up there, and I just find it just is that little bit more warmth, so a little bit less spicy. The other thing that I love about cool climate Shiraz is this structure you get. So when you taste that wine and you think about where the sort of furry tannins are in your mouth, you get this beautiful line right down the middle of the tongue, this real linear sort of tannin structure. And what this does is it holds all the flavors of the wine together and it gives it to you. And I kind of akin it to, you know, when, let's say you're at a 5-star restaurant and you order a steak, and your steak comes out nicely presented on this plate, and you've got your sides beautifully on the side and it's very delicately placed there, and you've got your various flavors of your steak and your vegetables and side dishes. And you can compare that to the exact same flavors of steak and side dishes and exact same complexity of dish, but at a pub where it's handed to you on a tray. And to me, this is one of the big things that I love about cool climate Shiraz. Warm climate Shiraz has all this texture and interest and flavor, and it just sort of bang gives it to you, and you're just like, wow, that's amazing. Cool climate Shiraz has all this texture and interest and flavor, but because of this structure, it just sort of delicately hands it to you and gives it to you slowly in a much more presentable way. And that's one of the things I really love about cool climate Shiraz. It's one of the things that is really hard to get. Now, for me, Canberra, the Hilltops, Young, and Heathcote are probably my pick of regions that really have that nice linear tannin structure to them that I love. But this is what I expect in a cool climate Shiraz. If you guys drink a lot, this is probably what you expect as well. And I love that one. I'm going to probably have that bottle tonight, I think, the Shiraz. I've mentioned a few times that I love old wines. So I'm going to slowly move on to our Cabernet. But, you know, I was really lucky when I went to uni that I did my uni degree before it was trendy to be a winemaker. So I think there was maybe about 5 or 10 of us who did uni when I went through, and about 2 years later, there's about 200. So definitely before it was cool to be a winemaker. But what it meant was some of the people teaching us, and Nick Bulliard at the time who's a master of wine, he was teaching us about wine tasting and wine styles. And it meant that he could bring something really special out of his cellar for the 5 of us to taste. Whereas as soon as there was 200 people, he couldn't just grab one bottle out of the cellar. He had to make sure there was enough for everyone to taste. And he tells this great story where he was down in Adelaide and there's this old pub being smashed down, and he looked inside the skip, and at the bottom of the skip, he saw this little half bottle of wine, and he grabbed it out and he brought it into uni and we tasted it. And it turned out to be a 1956 McGill's Burgundy. And so that's Penfolds before it was Penfolds, off the original McGill's vineyard. And this wine was amazing. Aged wines or aged reds have these funky characters where you describe them, they don't sound good at all. So, you know, I'm using descriptions like soy sauce and fish sauce and composting guavas and that sort of thing. You think, oh, you're not selling this wine. But the flavors balance so beautifully for the fruit flavors. It was just an amazing experience. It reminded me also at uni, I had this flatmate who was a chef. And I remember he came out one day and one morning, he's like, I'm going to cook you French toast for breakfast. And I thought, oh, cool, this sounds great. And he's made this French toast and he's put these fried bananas on top and then some bacon and then covered the whole thing in maple syrup. And I'm thinking, bacon and maple syrup and bananas, what's going on here? Whoa, this is not going to work. And I tasted it and I thought, this is amazing. The way the savory and the fruit flavors and the sweet combine, and that saltiness from the bacon as well. There's this combination of these flavors that you don't expect to work well together. It's the same that I find is happening in this really old wine, is you get these funky, crazy flavors and these fresh, fruity flavors. And when they work together in perfect balance, it's just like a really mind-blowing experience. So since that day, I've been absolutely obsessed with making a wine that's 100% designed to age 50 years plus. Like it's a wine made to age. When we look around the world at who's the most well known for making delicate light reds that age really, really well, and we come up with Bordeaux. And Bordeaux, they created this technique they call post-ferment maceration. And what that means is when I ferment a wine, I normally leave it with the skins and stems, maybe for the ferment period of about 3 weeks. Sometimes I leave it a week or two after. But as soon as the ferment finishes and you're leaving it with the skins and stems, this is called post-ferment maceration. Now, this wine actually spends 18 months sitting with the skins and stems before we press it off. Then goes into barrel for 12 to 18 months, then into bottle for 12 to 18 months, and then we release it. So it's a long winemaking process. And what this does, it does two things. So there's a couple of things when we're aging a red wine. There's two things that I guess make a wine not age so well. The first thing is the fruit level. And if you can imagine a normal red wine, we might have a fruit level here, and we've got our savory level down here. And as it ages, our fruit level slowly drops and our savory level comes out. We sort of have our premium drinking when they're in balance here, which might be around about that sort of, maybe 10 to 20 year mark, maybe 30 year now with screw caps. So it sits around here. So if we want a wine that's going to last for 50 years, we need our fruit level to start up here. So as it ages and ages and ages, our fruit and savory levels are up here, which is around about that 50-year mark. So that's one problem that we're trying to create, really fruity wines. The second problem is really old wines go through this process that they call cracking up. And it's actually probably the best description for wine that is too old. And it's because, when you put a wine in your mouth, the flavors and textures fill the whole mouth. Well, when a wine's cracked up, there's this weird sort of zigzaggy gap down the middle of the tongue, and it literally tastes like acid water in the middle. So you can taste the wine on the outside, and that middle, there's this middle gap that's like acid water, and that's called cracking up. And that is a result of not having enough structure to the wine. So if we think about a young Cabernet, they've got that sort of edgy tannin, can be a little bit like chalky. You sort of want to go like that when you've drunk some. That edgy, chalky tannin, they're really short chains. So when I bottle that wine, I might have 100 of these short chains. And as the wine ages, those short chains join into a long chain, and a long chain is nice and soft and velvety. So that's one of the processes that's happening as you age a wine. So let's say we start with these 100 short chains, and then they join together to 50 long chains, which then join together to 25 even longer chains. Now, the problem is 25, not enough wine, not enough tannin in that wine to give it structure. So that's what causes this cracking up. So we want also a wine that's got high fruit, but also this structure that can keep it lasting longer and longer. So this technique of post-ferment maceration, there's so many skins and stems that's sitting in that tank for a long period of time. That means there's hundreds and hundreds of these short chain tannins floating around, and they're forced together into a long chain tannin. So then when I bottle that wine, I'm bottling that wine with 100 stable long chain tannins rather than 100 unstable short chain tannins. And that's how we get our structural length to it. This technique also gives us huge amount of fruit. And I have absolutely no idea how the French figured this out. So when I first made this wine, we got to the 3-month stage, and I opened up the sample tap and I filled my glass up and I smelled the wine. And I tasted the wine and I thought, holy hell, I've absolutely ruined this wine. This tastes disgusting. And so I started calling around some of my old winemaking friends and some old winemakers I know around Australia and asking them about it. And they all said the same thing. Oh yeah, you get to about 3 months, it tasted terrible. So we pressed it off. Don't worry, you put it into barrel, it softens out a bit, and then you can blend it out. It was all right. So that's sort of the feedback I got from everyone I talked to in Australia. And I was sitting there thinking, oh, do I really want to do this? You know, the textbooks and the French say it's got to be 12 to 18 months. What am I going to do? And at the time, Tractors Vineyard was a passion project. It was a side project. So I was doing a lot of contract work. I was doing a lot of consulting work. There's heaps of commercial sort of winemaking, which is a bit boring for me. And so I wanted to create a label that was 100% just about the way I want to make wines, a little bit experimental, but a little bit old school. And so I thought, you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm just going to do what they say. It says 12 to 18 months. I'm going to do it. So I left this in tank, and I left it and I got to have about 12 months and I tasted it. I thought, yeah, no, it's not really any better. And I waited to 18 months and, it softened out a little bit. It wasn't that great. Still really resiny and a bit bitter. I put it in a barrel for 12 months and softened again, but it's not that great. I'm thinking, this may be a failure. What should I do? I'll put it in a bottle and I'll see. And God, I don't know. I'll work out something later. So I put it in a bottle and it wasn't that great. And then after about 18 months in bottle, out of nowhere, it was like, bang, all this fruit just came from nowhere. It was unbelievable. And so much fruit. I actually didn't even like this wine for the first year or two. It was almost like a Sauv Blanc. It was so intense fruit. It was too much for me. And it just had that, and we still see a lot of it now. This is now 2015. So it's probably been in bottle now. I mean, bottle now for about 3 years. And we're still getting that really intense cassis, tomato leaf, capsicum characters in those wine. Really still quite fruity wine. So it's just settling down enough that fruit level now for me to enjoy that wine. Before this, it was just too fruity. And it's actually doing exactly what the technique should do. We've got these huge amounts of fruit, which are now settled down into a nice wine. We've got these nice, soft, velvety tannins that are complex. And in theory, this wine should last 50 years plus and give us a great, great, great aged wine. And I say in theory because I do not know anyone to date in Australia that has done this technique. And so we don't know whether the tannins and the complexities of the grape in Australia are the same in France. So in 50 years time, we can do another one of these Zoom meetings and these Zoom sessions, and I can tell you whether my experiment worked. But to date, it's doing exactly what I expected it to do. I'm really excited to be tasting this now in the next 10 or so years. When I first tasted it, when I got that huge amount of fruit, I was telling everyone, oh, I can't wait to taste this in 5 years' time. It's now only been another year or so past that date. and it is actually aging way better than I expected it to. That fruit level is still staying really fresh. It's still holding out there. And so, this is definitely going to get that 50-year mark. It's doing exactly what I expected to. So I'm kind of excited about this wine. Again, like the Pinot, we'll pull the 2015 off the shelf soon, let it mature in the cellar for a bit. For me, it's important the cellar's got to be well away from my house, because otherwise what happens is I've got a little cellar down here behind me under the floor. But this is the worst place to age a wine, because usually what happens, I have some friends over, we have a bottle or two, next thing we're down that cellar and all the wines I'm trying to age doesn't age so well, it ends up in my stomach. So the Pinot, the Cabernet, it's going to be aged well away from me, and then we'll probably re-release it. We might do like a 10-year and a 20-year and a 30-year release to our club members. So I want to be able to experience those sort of aged wines with everyone. So one more wine to look at. The last one we're going to look at is called 8,000 Vintages. This is a really cool one to end on. So the oldest record of winemaking in the world comes from a country called Georgia in Eastern Europe. And it's dated 6000 BC. So that's 3,000 years before Egypt. And if any of you are interested in history at all, there's a really great book called Ancient Wine that talks about how they proved the oldest record of winemaking in the world. Anyway, the Georgians do a famous red style that they call Kinsmerali. I was really lucky enough to spend 7 years consulting in Georgia. I do 6 months Australia, 6 months for Georgia, and I do that in 7 years. Amazing country, amazing people, amazing wines, definitely worth visiting there. But this is my homage to Georgia and my homage to the history of wine. This is our Australian version of Kinsmerali. Not a true Kinsmerali because it's not from the Kinsmerali region. That's why we call it 8,000 Vintages, but it's very true to style. Something that's really quite unique. I kind of sometimes describe it as a light port. It's got depth, complexity, and that structure of a nice red wine, but it's also got this nice fruity sweetness to it as well. It's a great match for like a mature cheddar or a really dark chocolate, or that, that American style barbecue, that really like smoky style barbecue. Great match for all of those things. Really, we sell a heap of it here in Australia. Mainly, a lot of it goes to Eastern Europeans and ex-Russians and that sort of thing. Super famous over there. Even I think it was 2002, I think it was. And Russia and Georgia had that little battle, and Russia put a embargo on any imports from Georgia, and it was still our biggest market. And we used to smuggle the Kinsmerali across the border in school buses. It's that famous over there. Really famous style. I love that we're starting to do it here in Australia. I'm trying to work with some of my Georgian friends. I want to bring over the traditional Crary and make it a bit more traditional than we are now. Yeah, unique, interesting, and I think that's a really good wine to end our little session on. So guys, this 10 wines, it's only actually a little snippet of what we do. This is a passion project, or originally was a passion project for me. As a result, we're a little winery. We have this really massive list of wines. I can't show you any of our sparkling wines, unfortunately, because I can't put them in little bottles. We are about to release a sparkling wine virtual session. We're going to look at 2 bottles of sparkling wine, probably a week over a 3-week period. So six sparklings over the period. They'll come with these special caps on them so that you can reseal them and spend the rest of the week slowly drinking them, so you don't have to drink them all on the night. I'll be running those sessions from the winery. We do all our traditional method champenois in the winery. So I'll be able to actually show you and demonstrate to you whilst we're at the session how we make the sparkling. We'll talk about the history of it. So I'm looking forward to those little virtual sessions. We're never going to stop these virtual tastings now. These are going to be ongoing for the rest of our lives anyway, because we've had great feedback from them. The ability to sit and experience our wines at home without worrying about designated drivers in your own time. I'm really enjoying it. working on how we can run them a bit more interactively. Yes, I know you guys can send me messages now and put your hand up and ask a question, which is fine. Guys, I've put some links up there. Would love you to join our mailing list and to follow us on Instagram and Facebook and YouTube. You know, I need to get 1,000 members on YouTube. I'm not allowed to personalize my page until I hit 1,000 members. So please follow our YouTube channel. Also, love you to buy some wines, of course. We've got a link there. Please don't get too confused. It takes you to the Vincentia cellars. We're associated with Vincentia cellars. I make great wines and I enjoy winemaking, but I'm pretty crap at the website side of things. And so we don't have a good wine shop. And so we're using theirs. You would have been sent a voucher to get a bit of a discount when you buy some wines there too. I'm going to end our session there. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Saturday. For those of you who are joining me on Zoom, I will stop my video, but I'll keep open for a while my chat session. And that way, if you have any questions you want to ask afterwards or any feedback, I'd love to get it. Look after yourselves, guys. I hope you have a great Saturday. I hope you still have some wines to enjoy and you enjoyed them. And I hope to see you maybe live down here in real person in the Southern Highlands some days, but even on one of our virtual tastings again. So guys, look after yourself. Have a lovely